May 1943. The Atlantic was vast enough to make men believe in mathematics more than luck. In the underground command rooms of Lorient, beneath layers of concrete and damp air, the maps told a story that seemed almost comforting. There was a gap in the Allied air patrol network, a window of ocean too wide for any aircraft to cross, too far from land for bombers to reach. Captain Heinrich Vogel traced that gap with a pencil, measuring the distances with quiet certainty. To him, it wasn't just an opportunity. It was geometry disguised as strategy. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz had called his U-boat commanders to an emergency meeting weeks earlier. The air war over the Atlantic was tightening like a net. Liberators from Iceland and Newfoundland were picking off submarines that once hunted in packs without fear. The wolf packs were turning into prey. Something had to change, and Vogel arrived with an answer written in logic and numbers. His plan, later archived in the Kriegsmarine's records, seemed unassailable. He proposed to run the submarines not submerged and silent, but fast and loud on the surface. 8 long-range Type 9 U-boats would travel together, in daylight, across the so-called Mid-Atlantic Gap. According to Vogel's charts, the Allies had no airfields close enough to cover that space. Even the formidable Consolidated B-24 Liberator, with its long wings and powerful engines, could not patrol that far while carrying bombs and fuel for a safe return. At most, it could reach 600 miles from base. The gap began at 700. That difference, the missing 100 miles, was his window. By sailing surfaced in formation, the boats could triple their speed from 6 to 17 knots. They would cross the gap in 5 days instead of 15. Less exposure, fewer risks, more reach. Every line of his math reinforced the illusion that precision equaled safety. The operational radius, the refueling curves, the loiter times, all were calculated down to the minute. The idea was bold, even elegant. 8 submarines moving like a convoy of predators, guarding each other's flanks. A pack of steel shadows cutting through the Atlantic in plain sight. To Dönitz, still a believer in aggressive momentum, the plan was irresistible. Numbers had logic. Courage could fill in the rest. Operation Seeteufel, Sea Devil, was approved on April 3rd. 8 captains received their orders. U-537, U-541, U-543, U-546, U-548, U-552, U-558, and U-564. Each carried a full load of torpedoes, anti-aircraft guns polished to shine in the spring light, and the same quiet pride that had driven the U-boat arm through 4 years of war. They were told they would move through a corridor beyond Allied reach, a place where even the ocean's dangers seemed manageable because the math was right. But war doesn't honor calculations. It exposes what they forget to include. What Vogel didn't know, and what no one in that room could have guessed, was that across the channel, men with slide rules and soldering irons were erasing his safety margin inch by inch. British engineers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had been working on the Liberator's endurance problem since winter. Every bolt of armor they removed, every fuel tank they squeezed into a bomb bay, stretched the bomber's wings farther across the Atlantic. By March, the modified, very long-range Liberators were already in the air, operated jointly by RAF Coastal Command and the U.S. Navy. Their patrol arcs now reached 850 miles from Newfoundland, exactly into the zone Vogel had marked as untouchable. In quiet coordination rooms, signals from Bletchley Park confirmed the enemy's plans. Coded transmissions from Lorient, decoded line by line, revealed the schedule, the number of submarines, even the intended route. The Allies didn't just expect them, they were waiting. So when the 8 U-boats gathered southwest of Iceland on May 11, 1943, the captains believed they were invisible, guided by pure logic. In truth, their entire formation was already outlined on radar screens thousands of miles away, traced by men who didn't need courage to win. Only patience. The next morning, as Vogel stood in his conning tower and scanned a horizon that seemed mercifully empty, a single bomber was already closing the distance, unseen and silent, carrying enough power to rewrite every calculation that had brought him there. Numbers, after all, only work when they include everything, especially what you don't know. While German officers were still drawing perfect lines across maps, British scientists were dismantling limits one rivet at a time. In a hangar in Newfoundland, a squadron of liberators stood in silence under the pale lights, their bellies open, their bomb bays stripped bare. Armor plating that once shielded the crews was pulled away and stacked on the floor. In its place went auxiliary fuel tanks, aluminum shells filled with aviation spirit that turned each aircraft into something entirely new. The engineers called them VLR, Very Long Range Liberators. Each modification came from a lesson learned in blood. Earlier aircraft had run out of fuel mid-patrol, forced to turn back while U-boats prowled untouched. The new configuration changed that. Every gallon of saved weight meant more time above the sea, more miles across the empty Atlantic, more chances to spot a periscope breaking the surface. By late March, the calculations that once made the ocean safe for submarines were already obsolete. The gap Vogel trusted was gone, closed quietly by mathematics more precise than his own. But it wasn't just fuel that shifted the balance. Deep inside a British lab in Malvern, a device no bigger than a suitcase was turning night into daylight. The ASV Mark III radar, operating on a wavelength the Germans didn't even know existed, could detect a surface submarine up to 12 miles away. To the naked eye, the Atlantic was black and endless. To this radar, it was filled with bright echoes of steel and movement. Submarines that once vanished into darkness now glowed like lanterns. And while machines reshaped the air war, another kind of intelligence, quieter and colder, was working in parallel. At Bletchley Park, the German Enigma messages had become less of a mystery and more of a routine. Operators intercepted Vogel's orders, transcribed them, decrypted them, and passed them to RAF Coastal Command. Every adjustment to his formation plan, every time a U-boat reported its position, the Allies already knew. When the submarines moved, their shadows were followed by pencil lines on Allied charts. To ensure there would be no surprises, the Americans and British built a web of communication so efficient it felt invisible. Patrol sectors were assigned, timing coordinated to the minute. The Atlantic, once a playground for the hunter, had become a stage lit from above and below. In the command centers, officers spoke in clipped tones, careful not to disturb the fragile rhythm of the plan. No one gloated. There was only the quiet certainty that the next encounter would be decisive. The safe gap was now a killing ground defined by patience and silence. And yet, none of this reached the men in Lorient. They were still checking bearings and fuel logs, still confident their mission was protected by distance and calculation. On April 3rd, the green light came through. Operation Sea Teufel was approved. 8 submarines, their crews young and hopeful, began preparing for the crossing. Somewhere over Newfoundland, the VLR Liberators were already waiting. Engines warmed, radars humming, and coordinates memorized. The trap was set, and the plan was greenlit anyway. 8 U-boats were about to sail into a rendezvous no one would ever forget. The rendezvous happened under a thin veil of northern cloud, the kind that made the horizon blur into a single sheet of darkness. It was May 11th, 1943, 2200 hours, and the sea southwest of Iceland looked like a place where nothing could happen. One by one, the silhouettes of the 8 U-boats surfaced from the black water, their diesel engines coughing to life as they found their assigned coordinates. No running lights, no chatter over the radio, just muffled engines, and the occasional flash of a signal lamp as captains aligned their courses. For the first time in months, they were not alone. Across 4 years of war, most submarine commanders had learned to distrust company. The ocean rewarded isolation. But Vogel's plan demanded unity. 2 columns of 4 boats, 500 meters apart, each ship's wake trailing silver in the moonlight. They would sail in this pattern across the mid-Atlantic gap, where Allied aircraft could not reach, or so they still believed. Each captain repeated the operational order in his logbook: zigzag every 20 minutes, submerge at dawn twilight, surface at 800 hours, maintain 17 knots, keep continuous air watch. The crews carried out the routine with military precision. Lookouts scanned the horizon through salt-streaked binoculars, their faces stung by cold wind. Men in the conning towers leaned against steel railings slick with spray, their eyes burning from sleeplessness. Below decks, the engineers monitored fuel levels and trim angles, comforted by the hum of engines running at full power. For the sailors, there was a rare feeling of confidence. The Atlantic felt huge again, empty and quiet. The wind blew steady from the northwest, the waves low enough to cut cleanly through. When dawn came, it painted the sea with the color of wet steel. The men on deck lit cigarettes, laughing softly at the absurd calm of it all. Even Vogel, who had built the plan on pure mathematics, allowed himself a trace of satisfaction. His formation moved like clockwork, disciplined, swift, invisible. But invisibility is never permanent. At 0800 hours, the order came to surface fully and begin the daylight run. Hatches opened, gun crews performed brief checks, and radio operators sent short encrypted transmissions to confirm position. One of those signals, routine, unremarkable, was intercepted within minutes. Hundreds of miles away, a small team at Bletchley Park translated it, cross-referenced it with earlier intercepts, and relayed the information to Allied Coastal Command. The chain was smooth, practiced, and almost impersonal. Within 10 minutes, 8 German submarines were dots on a plotting table in a control room lit by red lamps. Above the Atlantic, invisible waves pulsed through the air, signals from the Liberator's radar, sweeping across the sea like an unseen lighthouse. Somewhere high above the morning clouds, the first reconnaissance sweep had already passed over them. The men below never noticed. The hum of the engines and the rhythmic crash of waves drowned out the faint echo of a technology they didn't yet understand. By noon, the formation was deep in the heart of what they believed was safety. The boats continued their pattern, zigzag left, straighten, zigzag right, every 20 minutes like a heartbeat. They had crossed the threshold between fear and routine, trusting the numbers that had brought them here. And as the clock moved toward early afternoon, far to the west, a lone Liberator began to roll down the runway at Argentia, Newfoundland. Its wings trembled with weight, its fuel tanks full to the seams, and its crew silent under the engine roar. The aircraft lifted into the gray sky with just enough fuel and far too much reach. The Atlantic stretched beneath them like a sheet of hammered steel, smooth and endless, the kind of emptiness that could make even trained men feel small. Lieutenant Commander James Harrington sat in the left seat of his B-24D Liberator, call sign Atlantic Reaper, scanning the clouds ahead through polarized goggles. It was 0530 on May 12th, and the bomber had been airborne for more than 8 hours. Every vibration in the fuselage, every change in engine tone, was a reminder that the aircraft was flying at the edge of endurance, hundreds of miles beyond where anyone had believed a plane could reach. They had stripped Reaper to make that possible, 10 crewmen reduced to 8, no armor plating, no excess radio gear, every ounce of saved weight traded for more fuel. Auxiliary tanks filled the bomb bay where torpedoes once hung. Even the floor under Harrington's boots creaked faintly from the modifications. But what remained on board was pure precision. 8 depth charges, 8 general-purpose bombs, each tuned for shallow water detonation. In the nose, Ensign David Walsh adjusted the Norden bomb sight, its glass lenses glinting like an unblinking eye. Behind him, Petty Officer Robert Kellerman monitored the ASV Mark the Thurger radar, its circular screen pulsing faintly green in the half-dark. The hum of the radar filled the cabin like background static, a whisper of energy stretching miles ahead of the aircraft. It was a weapon that worked by patience. Every few seconds, a bright arc swept across the display and faded, carrying with it the possibility of contact. For the first hours, the screen had been empty. Then, at 13:32 hours, Kellerman leaned forward sharply. "Multiple returns," he said. The green blips began to resolve into distinct shapes. 8 of them, aligned in 2 neat rows. Harrington blinked, double-checked the bearing, and felt the cold tightening in his chest. 8 on the surface, formation pattern, range 18 miles, bearing 047. The numbers spoke for themselves. Submarines, surfaced, moving fast, unaware. He didn't need orders from command. The time for discussion was over. The bomber banked slightly, its 4 engines harmonizing into a higher pitch. The crew secured loose equipment, tightened harnesses, checked weapons. Walsh calibrated the bomb sight. The gunners swung their .50 caliber turrets forward. The sun was behind them, glaring off the Atlantic like a curtain of fire. To anyone below, the sky would look empty. As they descended, the horizon flattened and the targets came into range. Through the cockpit glass, the sea glimmered like glass broken into silver shards. Harrington's voice came over the intercom, calm and clipped. Approach vector southeast to northwest. Sun behind us. Hold altitude 200 feet. Speed 210 knots. Run straight through. The plan was brutally simple. A strafing run from bow to stern, releasing each weapon 3 seconds apart. No turns, no corrections, no second chances. Kellerman called out distance. 15 miles, 10, 8. The gunners could now see faint specks, tiny wakes cutting parallel lines into the water. The 8 U-boats were still running in formation, steady and exposed. Below, Lookout squinted into the bright haze, seeing only sun glare where the Liberator now hid. In the final minute, the bomber dropped to wave height. Spray streaked the lower windows, the engines roaring at maximum power. Harrington adjusted trim, the aircraft skimming so low that its shadow flashed across the crests like a fleeting ghost. Walsh's hand hovered over the release switch. Range 1 mile, Kellerman called. All contacts confirmed. Ahead, the formation held steady. 8 steel predators unaware of the hunter above. The seconds collapsed into silence before impact. 8 blips on a radar screen. 8 lives in formation. 40 seconds from a decision no handbook could ever help. They had counted drills until reflex replaced thought, but nothing on any checklist prepared a man for the instant when every choice becomes fatal in its consequences. At 1347, the world simplified into a single question. Dive or stand and fight. Alarms cut through the hum of engines and the low roar of diesel. On deck, men flung themselves for weapons, boots pounding steel, voices cracking orders that had never sounded so small. For a heartbeat, the formation looked like a machine being hurried into motion. Hatches slammed, gun crews scrambled, binoculars swung in frantic arcs. But machines are slow to change course when momentum is already committed. Vogel's voice moved through the chain like a struck bell. He ordered the line to remain on the surface and engage. It was an order born of the same arithmetic that had planned the crossing: speed, mutual support, and the confidence that concentrated flak could drive an aircraft away. The captains obeyed, not because the choice felt wise, but because doctrine and hierarchy needed no further proof in that instant. Men who had trained to trust one another now trusted an instruction that would decide their fate. Across the sky, the Liberator became a single point of light, and then a thunderous presence. Tracers stitched the air. 50 caliber rounds punched through the thin metal of the conning towers like wind through paper. The first bullets found the men on the bridges before the retaliatory crews could bring their larger guns to bear. Bridges emptied in seconds. Those hit were gone from the wheel. Those who were not were crushed by smoke, blood, and the sudden collapse of coordinated action. One man's body fell back into an open hatch and, by cruel coincidence, blocked the mechanism meant to seal away the interior and start the dive. Where procedure demanded 20 to 30 seconds to vanish beneath the surface, blocked hatches and jammed equipment turned those seconds into a death sentence for the trapped. The bomber's first depth charge detonated ahead of the lead boat, and the sea itself answered. A pressure wave hit the hull like a hammer. Rivets sheared, seams split, compartments flooded in a howl that could be heard through bulkheads and down narrow ladders. Bow sections listed up, then pitched down, cargo and men sliding toward sudden darkness. Others began the crash dive at the worst possible instant, half committed, half exposed, presenting their widest profile to the detonations. The resulting ruptures propagated along long, thin casings designed to resist steady pressure, not the instantaneous shock of a nearby explosion. Every second became a ledger of loss. Where gunners managed to bring 37mm and 20mm pieces to bear, their fire found aluminum and fabric, nicking skin and wires, but rarely striking vital systems. The Liberator shrugged off 3 hits to its wing and fuselage and pressed on, the men inside aware that each roll and burst of flak was the price of removing a threat that could choke convoys for months. Below the waterline, the math of pressure and structure turned clinical horror into a quick finality. Bulkheads cracked like brittle ice. Torpedo rooms filled with seawater that rushed in faster than valves could respond. Diesel tanks ruptured and then burst into flames that licked across the waves. One vessel managed an almost textbook crash dive, planes set to full, vents open, ballast flooding, but timing betrayed many. The stern would still break the surface even as bows angled toward the deep, and a charge detonating near that vulnerable seam could collapse bulkheads and snap shafts, leaving the boat spinning and unable to steer. Men who had trained to trust procedure found those procedures brittle when shock waves and blocked hatches interfered. In the water, those who escaped the initial blasts faced another enemy, the cold, merciless Atlantic, which claimed stamina and hope in equal measure. Life rafts and vests kept some afloat, but the minutes stretched and rescue could not erase the fact that the sea had taken many who had not even had a chance to feel fear. Amid the ruin, one commander did something the manuals forbade. Observing the bomber's profile and the timing of its runs, he ordered his men to fire until the last possible instant, to keep engines at full throttle, then to begin a dive that preserved forward motion. Guns spat until water crested the decks. Men abandoned positions and scrambled downward, while engineers kept the engines turning. It was an improvisation of desperation, half fight, half vanish. And because it was born of the moment rather than doctrine, it worked. That hybrid maneuver turned the boat from a stationary target into a moving shadow, and the final depth charge, dropped with lethal routine, fell into a column where a hull had been, and by a hair missed the living center of the submarine. The Liberator's run lasted barely over a minute. In that span, 7 of the 8 surfaced vessels were broken, burned, or sinking, and dozens of men were thrown into a sea suddenly full of wreckage. The aircraft itself came home scarred, holes rent through skin and structure, a casualty in its crew, and critical instruments smashed. The pilot had pressed the attack despite being a target for the very guns the submarines had barely raised. The decision to go through with it would later be lauded as audacity, and the statistics would mark it as effective. But in the immediate aftermath, there was only decision and consequence, the unglamorous work of counting lives afloat and tallying the damage that numbers had wrought in flesh and steel. What had felt like an equation on paper became a storm of human detail, the wrenching of metal, the small, desperate actions of sailors flinging belts and boots into the sea, the frantic signals sent and unanswered. In those 40 seconds, doctrine met innovation, and the result was irreversible. Time ceased to be a line of events and became, as one survivor would later put it, a single hammer blow that changed the shape of the war at sea. The first impact tore the sky apart. At 13:47 and 12 seconds, the Liberator's nose guns opened fire, white streaks of phosphorus tracing perfect, lethal geometry down to the lead submarine. The rounds punched through steel as if through foil, slicing open the conning tower in a burst of vapor and blood. Vogel, still holding his binoculars, vanished in the flash. His body never reached the deck. The forward crew fell before the sound of the first explosion even reached their ears. One lookout, sprinting for the 37mm gun, collapsed backward into the open hatch, sealing the fate of everyone below. The path to submerge, their last escape, was blocked by their own fallen man. At 13:47 and 18 seconds, the first depth charge hit the water, a dark cylinder tumbling through the sunlight. It detonated at 25 feet, close enough that the pressure wave lifted the submarine's bow clear out of the sea. The shock rolled through the hull, popping rivets, cracking joints, bursting gauges. Inside, lights shattered, pipes ruptured, men were flung against bulkheads. The torpedo room flooded in seconds. The bow pitched downward and never rose again. 3 seconds later, the second Liberator bomb found U-541 mid-dive. Her captain had reacted instantly, flooding ballast tanks, angling the bow down. She was almost safe when the charge went off 30 feet from her stern. The explosion crushed the after torpedo compartment and tore open the fuel lines. Diesel poured into the water, igniting into a floating firestorm that swept across the sea. The submarine's stern lifted, vertical for a heartbeat, before the ocean swallowed it whole. At 13:47 and 24 seconds, the third depth charge found U-543. The crew managed to bring their 37mm gun to life, throwing a string of shells into the sky. 3 struck the bomber's wing, punching holes but doing no damage that mattered. Then came the reply, machine gun fire that shredded the deck. The charge detonated directly beneath the hull, midship. The pressure wave was so violent that the boat literally broke apart, lifting clear of the surface before splitting in two. The halves vanished almost in unison, leaving nothing but bubbles and silence. By now, the Atlantic itself seemed to roar. The Liberator flew straight through the smoke, its engines screaming, its belly emptying one weapon after another. Every few seconds came another eruption, a bloom of white water, then black smoke, then fragments of steel tumbling back to the waves. At 13:47 and 30 seconds, U-546 began her dive. Her captain, Korvettenkapitän Paul Dietrich, had realized what the others had not. There was no fighting this. He sealed the hatch, ordered maximum ballast flood, and drove the boat down. The next explosion struck 50 feet away. The shock slammed the hull, shattered glass, sent tools flying, but it held. Dietrich ordered deeper, 100 feet, then 200. The water swallowed them, muffling the sounds of death above. They would be the only ones to make it out alive. But on the surface, 5 boats still fought a battle already decided. At 13:47 and 36 seconds, U-548 erupted into flame. A depth charge had torn through her fuel system, turning the sea around her into an inferno. Men leapt overboard straight into burning water. Those who reached the edge of the slick clung to floating debris, the heat searing the backs of their necks. U-552, which had first spotted the Liberator, was hit next. Her guns still fired in bursts, 20mm shells tearing at empty sky, but the bomber's return fire cut every man on deck. The depth charge struck beneath the control room, splitting the submarine's heart. She went down bow first, lights flickering until they went dark. 14 seconds from surface to silence. U-558 tried to flee. Engines at full power, she ran at 18 knots, a desperate sprint across an ocean that offered no cover. The next blast crippled her rudder, locking it hard to starboard. The submarine began to circle endlessly, trapped in its own spiral. Her captain ordered the crew to abandon ship. Dozens jumped, swallowed by smoke and foam, as the boat turned one last time before vanishing. The sea boiled with destruction. In less than a minute and a half, 7 submarines were gone. The air shimmered with oil vapor, the water slicked black with diesel. Shattered wood, paper, and pieces of uniforms drifted between the fires. The Liberator rose out of the chaos, its wings glinting, the smell of burnt fuel trailing behind. One submarine remained, U-564. Her young commander, Reinhard Surin, had seen every second of the massacre unfold, the tower of flame from U-548, the twisted silhouette of U-543 breaking in half, the firestorm rolling over the water. He alone understood what the pattern meant. Every surface target died, every dive came too late, every calculation failed, and as the Liberator banked for another run, he made his own calculation, not from doctrine, but from instinct. Only one commander had watched long enough to see the rhythm of destruction and decide to do something that no manual had ever written down. U-564's deck was chaos, a blur of motion, smoke, and shouted commands that fought to rise above the roar of engines and gunfire. Commander Reinhard Surin had seconds to choose between the 2 impossible orders every submariner dreaded: fight on the surface, or dive and drown unseen. But as he watched the Liberator bank for its next attack run, he saw the pattern. Every captain who had gone under had been caught half exposed. Every boat that stayed up had been shredded before it could even fire a second burst. The solution, if it existed, was somewhere between. He didn't hesitate. "Guns stay manned until water touches your boots," he shouted through the bridge tube. "Engines full ahead. Prepare for emergency dive on my mark." The crew obeyed without question. On the forward deck, gunners locked their grips, firing upward as tracer rounds streaked through the haze. The air filled with a shrieking web of metal. 20mm and 37mm shells bursting around the Liberator as it dove. One found its mark, punching through the bomber's fuselage and killing a waist gunner instantly. Another tore through the radio compartment, blowing out the transmitter in a spray of glass and sparks. Inside the bomber, Lieutenant Commander Harrington felt the whole aircraft tremble. The right wing shuddered. Fragments of aluminum sprayed into the air like glitter. He glanced at the fuel gauge, barely enough to make it back to base. There was no time to second guess. "We press the attack," he said evenly, his voice calm through the headset. Behind him, Ensign Walsh, the bombardier, crouched low over the Norden sight, hands trembling slightly from the last shockwave. The sea below spun with fire and debris. U-564 was still on the surface, still shooting. Walsh adjusted the sight, calculating angles that shifted with every second: speed, altitude, distance, wind drift, submarine velocity, and now the added complexity of a diving target. His brain ran faster than the analog dials. The submarine was descending, but still moving forward. If he released too early, the depth charge would miss. Too late, and it would overshoot. He had 3 seconds to solve a problem that would decide the lives of 50 men. At 13:48 and 22 seconds, he pressed the release. The bomb bay yawned open, and one last depth charge tumbled into the air. It hit the water just behind U-564's stern, falling through 40 feet before detonating 20 feet too shallow. The explosion shook the sea, sending a white dome of spray into the air, but it missed the submarine by less than a ship's length. Inside U-564, the lights flickered, glass shattered, and men were thrown from their bunks, but the hull held. The boat leveled off at 250 feet. Engines still running, gauges trembling in their casings. Suren exhaled slowly. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips, could hear water seeping into minor leaks somewhere in the stern, could smell the acrid sting of burnt oil. Around him, men stared in silence at the depth gauge, watching the needle settle. The submarine creaked, alive but wounded. They had escaped not through skill, but through fractions. A near miss measured in feet and milliseconds. Above, the Liberator circled the wreckage field once more. Oil fires floated on the waves, spreading across a horizon that looked more like night than day. Through the haze, the bomber's crew could see men in the water, tiny shapes clinging to debris, hands raised, voices too distant to hear. Harrington's co-pilot tapped the fuel gauge again. The needle had dipped into the danger zone. They'd stayed too long. With only 900 gallons remaining, barely enough for the return flight, the commander turned northwest toward Argentia. The engine strained as Atlantic Reaper climbed back into the mist, its crew bruised, deafened, and grimly quiet. Below, the survivors of 7 sunken boats floated in 44-degree water, counting their heartbeats as the cold seeped in. The Liberator vanished into the clouds, leaving nothing but fire, oil, and silence to mark what had happened there. Above, a bomber counted its remaining gallons. Below, men counted the seconds until the sea took its due. The Atlantic that afternoon looked like the aftermath of an industrial nightmare. Patches of burning fuel, smoke drifting low over a blackened sea, and twisted pieces of metal turning lazily in the swell. From above, it would have seemed empty again, but on the surface, hundreds of men were still alive, scattered among the oil and wreckage. They clung to ammunition crates, life vests, fragments of decking, anything that would float. Their faces were streaked with soot and salt, their hands blistered from gripping metal that moments ago had been home. At first, there was sound, the hiss of fire on water, the faint crack of ammunition cooking off inside sinking hulls, the calls for help in German, in fragments of prayer, in breathless gasps that barely reached the next survivor. Then, as the hours passed, the noise thinned to a kind of stunned quiet. The sea, as always, took its time. The temperature of the water was 44 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to steal strength in minutes. Men who had survived the explosions now faced a slower, quieter struggle, fingers numbing, eyes closing, as exhaustion overtook instinct. At 14:42, a coded transmission reached the Canadian corvette HMCS Drumheller, part of Escort Group C2. Commander Anthony Griffin read the message twice. Multiple U-boats destroyed, survivors in the water, precise coordinates transmitted from Argentia. Without hesitation, he altered course. The small ship plowed southeast at full speed, 16 knots against a rolling sea, her bow cutting through the oil-streaked waves as the sun began to sink. 4.5 hours later, at 18:20, Drumheller reached the coordinates. The sight that greeted the crew left even veterans speechless. The horizon glowed orange where diesel burned, the sea littered with planks, life jackets, and bodies that rose and fell with the rhythm of the swells. Oil coated everything, men, wreckage, even the rescue lines thrown from the ship's railings. The air smelled of fuel and salt and something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. Griffin's orders were simple: no politics, no hesitation. Rescue everyone you can. The crew launched boats into the slick, hauling in survivors one by one. Some were conscious, their lips blue, hands trembling violently from the cold. Others had slipped into stillness, faces pale, but eyes half open. Many could no longer speak, their vocal cords numbed by seawater. Sailors who hours earlier had loaded depth charges now found themselves wrapping shivering Germans in blankets, pressing hot coffee into their hands. The men couldn't understand each other's words, but the look in their eyes said enough. The war felt far away. By the time the last man was pulled aboard, the numbers told a story that statistics would never capture. Of 68 who had entered the water, 42 were recovered. 31 of them still breathed. 11 more were lifted out too late, bodies preserved by cold that had stolen their warmth long before rescue arrived. 26 were never found at all. The ocean kept them, just as it had kept their boats. Griffin ordered the dead sewn into canvas shrouds weighted with iron bars. The next morning, as the corvette turned southwest toward Halifax, the crew gathered on deck. The engines idled low. One by one, the bodies were committed to the sea, each sliding gently from the plank, disappearing into the gray water. The ceremony was quiet, without distinction of flag or language. When an officer questioned why enemy sailors deserved such honors, Griffin answered only once. They were submariners. The sea is their grave, same as ours. Below deck, the survivors lay in cramped bunks, wrapped in coats and blankets that smelled of engine oil. They were no longer enemies, only men with frostbitten fingers and hollow eyes. Some wept quietly, others stared at the ceiling, trying to remember how long they'd been in the water. The Canadians moved among them with cups of broth, dry socks, and the clumsy kindness that fills the silence after catastrophe. By the time Drumheller reached Halifax on May 15th, the survivors had begun to speak again, names, ranks, fragments of memory. Their captain, Friedrich Ahlreich, dictated a list of the lost, 382 names written in a trembling hand on the corvette's stationery. Griffin signed beneath it, enemies, now joined by ink and salt water. As Drumheller steamed into port, signals officers were already on board, taking statements, asking questions, piecing together how 8 U-boats had dared to sail in formation across a sky they thought was empty. The bodies were gone, the fires extinguished, but the implications were only beginning to burn. While blankets and coffee replaced bullets, another battle had already started, quiet, bureaucratic, and no less decisive, inside the war rooms. In Berlin, 2 days later, the message arrived in the gray dawn. It was written in the clean bureaucratic German of naval dispatches, numbers, coordinates, timestamps, but there was no language in which it could sound routine. 7 boats lost, 1 missing, presumed sunk, 382 men unaccounted for. The phrase total Verlust, total loss, appeared again and again, each repetition colder than the last. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz read it alone in his office at the Oberkommando der Kriegsmarine. For a man who measured war by tonnage sunk and U-boats launched, this report was a mirror turned cruelly inward. Operation Sea Teufel, the mathematical masterpiece meant to outsmart the Allies, had lasted less than 15 minutes. In that span, a strategy, a myth, and a generation of commanders had gone down together. The loss wasn't just tactical, it was existential. If Allied aircraft could strike deep in the mid-Atlantic, if radar could find submarines long before they saw the sky, if signals intelligence could anticipate every order, then the Wolfpack, his proud creation, was finished. The doctrine that had nearly starved Britain into submission was obsolete, undone not by bravery or cowardice, but by circuits, antennas, and calculations invisible to the human eye. On May 16th, the new operational directive went out. All daytime surface formations were banned. Submarines would travel alone, submerged, surfacing only under darkness to charge batteries. The wolf would hunt no longer in packs, but as a scattered shadow, silent, defensive, fearful. The order marked a turning point not only in the Battle of the Atlantic, but in how Germany would fight the rest of the war at sea. The hunters had become the hunted, and courage alone could not rewrite physics. Far from Berlin, one remnant of the failed operation still moved beneath the waves. Wolf 546, the only survivor, limped home across the Atlantic with cracked valves and a shaken crew. Commander Paul Dietrich had saved his men through the reflex of disobedience, by diving when others stayed up. But survival offered little comfort. His log entries after May 12th were few, written in a tight, weary hand. "The sea took the rest," he wrote. "It lets us go, only to remember." 2 years later, in April 1945, his boat was found and destroyed by the USS Flaherty during the final sweep of the war. Dietrich went down with it, along with the same men he had once saved. Across the ocean, Lieutenant Commander James Harrington stood on the tarmac at Argentia, watching his crew step out of the battered Atlantic Reaper. 1 gunner dead, 2 wounded, 23 holes in the fuselage. The bomber looked less like a victor than a survivor. For his actions that day, Harrington would later receive the Navy Cross, though he never mentioned the mission again. In letters to his wife, he described only a long flight and longer silence. He flew 37 more sorties before being rotated home that November, finishing the war with a chest full of medals and a mine that never landed. The 31 German sailors rescued by HMCS Drumheller lived on, but life felt borrowed. For years, they carried a guilt that no confession could lighten, the knowledge that their survival was accidental, that they lived because others had sunk a few seconds faster. In Canadian internment camps, they worked the land, planted crops, and listened to the quiet of a world without engines or alarms. Some stayed after the war, too changed to return home. Others went back to Germany and tried to rebuild lives on land that no longer seemed stable. Dönitz, the admiral who had sent them, later called May 1943 the Black Month. The same man who once spoke of victory through faith now spoke of arithmetic, production ratios, fuel shortages, convoy density. The romance of the sea had given way to ledgers and reports. The Wolfpack was history, replaced by silence and solitary runs through darkness. What that orders changed overnight, the ocean would remember forever. The Atlantic keeps its secrets well. At 47 degrees, 23 minutes north, 19 degrees, 41 minutes west, there is nothing to see. No marker, no monument, not even a buoy to suggest that anything ever happened there. Only water, endlessly moving, a surface so calm it hides 7 shapes resting 2,400 feet below. The hulls are still there, slowly surrendering to rust and pressure, each a sealed tomb of steel and memory. Inside those boats, silence has replaced the noise of engines and alarms. The men who once filled those narrow corridors remain where they fell, fixed in a final stillness that outlasts every flag and every order. The ocean took them impartially, folding them into its own arithmetic. 7 lost vessels, 382 names reduced to coordinates on a map. Above, ships still cross the same waters, their crews unaware that beneath them lies a chapter of war written not in victory, but in consequence. What happened on May 12, 1943, was more than a battle. It was a point of inflection. For 4 years, courage had been the only currency the U-boat arm trusted. But in those 15 minutes of destruction, courage met its limit. Technology had changed the terms of survival. The Liberator's radar, the extra fuel tanks, the signals intercepted miles away. None of them required heroism, only understanding. It was the beginning of a new kind of war, where victory no longer depended on the bravery of individuals, but on the coordination of thousands of unseen minds working in quiet rooms. The mathematics of modern conflict was merciless. More fuel meant more reach. More data meant fewer surprises. Every improvement in one machine rendered another obsolete. The submariners who trusted steel and instinct could not compete with an enemy that built its advantage out of electrons and patience. Their defeat was not moral, but mechanical. And yet, the story refuses to end as numbers. Each man who boarded those U-boats left behind a home, a photograph, a set of plans for what he would do when the war ended. Each man believed his skill and discipline would be enough. They were wrong, but not dishonored. They fought in a moment when bravery was already being outpaced by invention, when decisions made in laboratories and decoding centers mattered more than the will to fight. The survivors who drifted in the water that day, the airmen who flew home over wreckage and flame, the sailors who hauled frozen enemies from the sea, they all carried fragments of the same realization. that war had shifted forever. It had become a contest of systems, not spirits. The Atlantic has no voice, but if it did, it would not speak of heroes or villains. It would speak of the transformation that unfolded in its depths, how the age of industrial courage gave way to the age of technological inevitability. The men who sank there were not defeated by fear or failure. They were overtaken by progress. Somewhere above those silent graves, sonar still echoes off the ocean floor, brief pings that vanish into distance. Each one returns a faint reply, a whisper from the deep that reminds us what was traded for victory. 7 boats, 382 souls, 15 minutes. The arithmetic of war remains simple, but the human cost never is. Fade forward, 2 more stories waiting in the same dark ledger, how radar turned night into day, and how a single invention erased the idea of safe distance forever.